And finally, we're designed to hate feeling that we're wrong. Researchers call it confirmation bias, but it's the idea that if you believe something, particularly if it's connected to your worldview, it is very difficult for you to take on information that might force you to reconsider your beliefs. It's not all the time with all people on all subjects, but it's a fact of life that no one likes to admit that they're wrong. So if a friend or family member keeps sharing misinformation, it might seem sensible to share more fact checks with them, but unless it's done in the right way, it can actually make people double down on their false beliefs. It feels safer. It makes you feel better to stick with what you originally thought. So before we end this, what can we all do about it? So remember when I said we have fewer traditional gatekeepers like news anchors? Fewer and fewer of us are getting our news from traditional news sources. So we now have actually thousands more people who play a role where they are trusted within their community. So for example, of the people on this call, maybe some of you run a neighborhood page on Facebook. Maybe some of you host a reading group once a month. Maybe you coach a softball team. Maybe you run a professional association. Maybe you own a coffee shop or a salon where members of the community get together. Maybe you're more of a traditional gatekeeper. Maybe you're a faith leader. Maybe you're a librarian, an educator, or a local radio host. Whatever you are, whoever you are, people trust you. So nowadays, people trust different kinds of people, but increasingly they trust people they feel connected to because of their faith, job, shared hobbies, background, or location. So when it comes to making decisions about their personal health, for example, while doctors, pharmacists, and nurses still have an important role to play, we know that increasingly people turn to others, either online or in their community right next to them. And so that's great if those people are sharing good information, but if the information is wrong, it can cause serious harm. So one of the key challenges in society today is to help more people learn how to access accurate information and how to avoid information designed to sow distrust, doubt, and confusion. Remember those KGB spies from the 1980s, the same thing. They were trying to sow distrust, doubt, and confusion. And that is what's happening now in 2021 and is why the country feels so divided. So unfortunately, as I've tried to underline, there are people looking to take advantage of others who deliberately create and share false and misleading information for the purpose of making money for themselves, to build their personal reputation and therefore influence, or simply to try to cause trouble to see what they can get away with. And so seeing as we've now recognized that, and we know that our friends and family are sometimes sharing that disinformation, they're sharing as misinformation, they don't realize it's harmful, they don't realize it's wrong. So what can you do? So I'm going to tell you 6 things. Firstly, listen. The best way to talk to people about their beliefs is not actually to talk to them, it's to really listen to their fears and why they believe what they do. Try not to focus on the content or the specific false claim. Focus on the wider issue and how they feel about that issue. As I said, while it's sometimes tempting to pull out a fact check to prove somebody's wrong, this can shut down a conversation as no one likes to be told they're wrong. So when everybody's getting together around that Thanksgiving table next month, rather than trying to shut down Uncle Bob, listen to Bob and try and understand why he feels what he does about certain issues. And the next thing goes hand in hand, empathize. When talking with your friends and family, emphasize the fact that you understand that there are often reasons why people find it difficult to trust certain sources of information. Ask questions to understand where they're coming from. Admit that you've struggled and continue to struggle with working out what's true or false. And where possible, talk about times where you've fallen for misinformation and explain why you were susceptible. That's what I did at the beginning. I didn't come on here as a misinformation expert to say you're doing it all wrong. I said, I've got fooled too. And that's kind of the kind of conversations you want to have with people. Thirdly, use inclusive language. So use terms like our community, our neighborhood, our family, we, us. So the person feels that you understand their feelings rather than simply telling that they're wrong. If you say, hey, you're wrong, Bob, I'll tell you why I'm right. Like you really want to say, look, Bob, I'm worried about this stuff too. Like I see this stuff circulating in our community. I'm worried about it. I'm struggling to see what's true or false, but I'm worried that people are coming in here and they're deliberately trying to cause harm. So the more you can use that kind of language or phrasing, you know, I'm worried people are targeting our community, people are trying to sow distrust of institutions, or people have expertise. You know, that's the kind of language you want to use. Next, don't publicly shame. So where possible, try and have these conversations one-on-one, either face-to-face, Zoom to Zoom, via direct messages, but try not to do it in the comment section, or, you know, on Instagram or Facebook. You don't want someone to feel ashamed. And having these conversations in the comments threads can then kind of just blow up and other people pile on. And so some research shows that making public corrections can help only if you're absolutely convinced that the people that you're talking with are really close and would understand that you're coming at this with the right intentions. Because remember, no one likes to appear to be wrong. Next, point to trustworthy messengers. End the conversation with the person emphasizing how hard it is to find accurate information, especially around new events like the pandemic, when the information is constantly changing, which will always happen. When we have new events, we can't say, what's the truth? Well, that's what researchers are for. We need to be patient and learn what's emerging as the research happens. But try and help people understand that they need to find expert gatekeepers who are not in a position to personally profit or to gain power or influence when seeking information. And remind them that an expert on one topic might not be the best expert to turn to around another topic. And finally, where you can, report misinformation to the platform. Like picking up a Coke can that people have thrown out of their car, we all need to help keep the information landscape a little less polluted. So I hope that there was something here that you could take away and find useful. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I would love to hear if there are any questions so that we can continue this debate rather than me just talking at you. So thank you again for inviting me, and thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so at this point, we would like to have Dave Baskin, the co-chair of the President's Speaker Committee, to assist us in filtering the questions that are going to come through the Q&A that's at the bottom of your screen. So Dave, if you could kind of jump in, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm visible right now. I'm not seeing my picture, but I am hearing everything. And we do have a couple of questions that have come in so far. The first one is from someone who wanted to know whether you believe that the government should intervene against social media companies to prevent the spread of misinformation.
It is a great question, and it is a question that many people are asking right now. I do not think that governments should be involved in making decisions around content itself. I find that deeply problematic. What governments should be doing is putting pressure on the platforms to force them to release data so that researchers can understand what's happening. So for example, financial services, they have to be audited by independent third-party agencies that ensure that there's no wrongdoing happening in a financial services company. These platforms are, well, we saw this last week when there was Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp all went down. They're the lifeblood of the whole planet. They are the communication system. So the idea that we have this incredibly powerful set of companies and no one government has the power to do anything over them, that's concerning. But the power that we do need is governments to say, researchers need to be able to audit what people are seeing. They need to be able to study what harm misinformation is causing. And through that, there needs to be a way that as society, we can have a conversation about the harms of misinformation and the kind of information that we want online. But I feel really, really strongly, and in fact, there are countries like Brazil, Malaysia, Uganda, where the government plays a very heavy hand in the information that you can access. Now, that is not a situation that America wants to be in, but I do think the government can put pressure on these platforms to say, enough is enough, Mark Zuckerberg. You have this incredible power. You can do whatever you want on your platform and there's no oversight. So the government needs to create a situation of oversight, but not on the content itself.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we do have another question. I think this one is really interesting. Someone was wondering, when we have different reputable sources that report a story in different lights, what would be the best way to determine what the truth really is?
Yeah, and I mean, that's something that we're all, grappling with every day. If I go to Google News and I put in a topic, I can see 10 different headlines from 10 different news outlets telling me 10 different aspects of the story. And I think one thing I would say is that there's rarely kind of a truth. There are different aspects to an event and a situation. And by reading widely, you want to understand as many different aspects as possible, rather than what's the truth. I mean, there are facts, which is, did something happen at 10:29 or was it 10:31? I mean, that's the thing that we need to trust all journalism outlets to get right. But in terms of reading widely, that allows you to say, well, okay, this outlet interviewed that person, that person, that person, and I understand that bit, but this outlet didn't interview that person and ignored that part of their story, but that seems quite important to me. So I think, as I said, one amazing thing about the internet is that we don't just have to go to the Washington Post every day or the Chicago Tribune, that we have an ability to see more information. I wish I could say, if you go to this site every single day, you will get the truth. But the world is messy. You know this. You talk to your friends about what happened at the party last night. Everybody's got a slightly different version of events. And that's what happens in the news business. And so it's kind of up to us as consumers to ensure that we are, trying to get a wider picture, which is why I'd say having different sources every day is better than relying on just one.
So you're saying partly look at the sources that the sources are getting their information from.
Yeah, so I would say if there's a number of very, very good news outlets in this country.
Sure.
And so if you consistently are kind of looking at a range of those kind of sources, so things like the Associated Press or Reuters, who are news agencies that provide information to others, reputable online newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, those kind of sites, you're going to get a really good sense of what's going on. But I think what I'm trying to say is that news organizations, they always have a limited space. They tend to call up the sources that they know are going to pick up the phone quickly. Does that mean that they're the best source at any given time? Which is why you want to read as much around a topic as you can, because you're never going to get the best information from any one news outlet. You want as many as possible.
Keep your options open.
Yeah.
We have another question here from someone viewing who wanted you to comment on attempts to erode the credibility of experts such as Dr. Fauci.
Yeah, well, that is absolutely a deliberate tactic. So by doing that, he's, the nation's doctor. Rather than undermining what he's saying, if you can undermine him, it means that everything he says no longer appears trustworthy to people. So by undermining the credibility of the source, that is a tactic. And it was an early tactic by people who were nervous about, what they were seeing in terms of the pandemic. And he became this kind of this figure that by undermining him, it was a shortcut to making lots of people, not trust anything that he said. So again, that's a tactic itself, and it's something that people should look to, which is undermining the source of credible information.
Thank you. Yeah. Someone else wanted to know, how harmful can misinformation get? Is there an extreme we should be concerned about? I share that concern too.
Yeah, so I mean, in the health space, we've seen, unfortunately, cases of, for example, in Iran, 40 people died because there was a rumor that if you drank alcohol, a lot of alcohol, then it would protect you, and lots of people died. In Latin America, there was MMS, which is a kind of like a miracle bleach cure. Unfortunately, some people took too much of that and died. So we have those kind of the very serious case. I would say that some of the misinformation around the vaccines, which have meant certain people did not believe that they worked or didn't understand how they could protect them. Unfortunately, many people have lost their lives by not being vaccinated. Now, I would say not for everybody. There are many reasons that people didn't get vaccinated, but there are certain people that it was clear from talking to friends and family afterwards that they believed some of the misinformation that was circulating, like the vaccine will change your DNA, that Bill Gates was going to implant a microchip. That is a real harm. And then when we talk about democracy, I am really worried that, with 30% of the country saying that they believe that this election was stolen and they don't believe that the election was fair and free. Well, what happens in 2022 with the midterms? What happens with 2024 when people say, well, I don't believe that vote count is safe? well, what happens then if there's no agreement on an election result in a country that is the foundation of democracy? So going back to the drip, drip, drip analogy, I might see a post that's saying, mail-in ballots weren't safe, and it's somebody's edited a video and it looks like somebody was stuffing the ballot into the box. It wasn't safe. Now, I might look at that and say, how harmful is that really, that individual drip? But when over a series of months, people are told by their political leaders, by their friends on Facebook, by things that, people are talking about at the golf club, they keep hearing election wasn't safe. I'll tell you why it wasn't. I've done my own research. It wasn't safe. You can't trust it. Well, then that becomes your reality. And people are living in this reality of, I don't think I can trust the election result. And that is a harm that I don't think we've really got our heads around yet. And I still have people say, yeah, whatever, Claire, misinformation stuff on Facebook, on Instagram, what's the problem? And I'm like, oh, this is the problem. Because over time, when you've got people who don't trust experts, they don't trust each other, they don't trust institutions, like that is not a society that stays well, and I know this sounds, over the top, and I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer, because I think we can claw this back, but only if we take misinformation seriously. And therefore we have to take the harms of misinformation seriously so that people actually start taking action.
Right. And the person who asked the question wanted to know what's kind of worst case scenario with that. So that's what you're addressing.
Yes.
Yeah.
You cannot assume that democracy is going to continue just because it has continued for over 200 years. And I mean, I'll say this as somebody not from this country. This country is a miracle. This country is this huge country of 365 million people, whatever it is. People in California are very different to people in North Carolina, very different from Alabama to, Michigan. But it's this incredible country that's built on this foundation of the strength of democracy, the American dream. It is a miracle, but I worry that people are taking that for granted and not realizing that it's built on a belief that the democratic system can be trusted. If people don't trust that system, then the country could potentially tear itself apart. And I know, and I'm only saying it because I want people to take this seriously, because I hope that that's not the direction we're going at all. But if we don't have the conversation about what it might end up in, I don't want historians to look back and be like, oh, in 2021, they were sitting there watching Netflix, didn't take it seriously. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but I think we have to think about it much more seriously than we are doing.
So here's a really interesting question about prevention, kind of more big picture, that one of our attendees wants to know. Her name is Kristen. She wanted to thank you for the talk and said that one of her biggest takeaways is that it's so important that we are taking responsibility for our own information and for cleaning our information environment. And she believes that it comes down to education and digital literacy. So what would your recommendations be in teaching digital literacy more systematically in our schools?
I love this question so much.
Me too.
So there are some really good digital literacy programs, but I worry sometimes that it's very much like, well, make sure you Google the headline, make sure that you're careful. I mean, some of the things that I said tonight, but actually recently, some of the best research shows that something called inoculation is the most effective form of digital literacy. And inoculation is teaching people the tactics and techniques, because experiments show that the more you show people those tactics and techniques, they are more likely to spot misinformation in the wild, irrespective of whether they're right wing, left wing, doesn't matter who they are, because as humans, none of us want to be fooled. So in my talk, when I was talking to you about tactics and the ways that disinformation agents try to fool you, that was inoculation. So in terms of what we should be teaching people in classrooms, it's things like, here's a really good game, is you're in a classroom and you say, pretend you're a disinformation agent. And your job is to sway the local mayor's election in the town. How would you sway the election using disinformation? And it feels a bit scary as an educator, like, oh, I can't get people to pretend to be a disinformation agent. But by getting them to think about the tactics they would use, and they say things like, oh, I would start a blog, I'd create some fake accounts, I'd put a poster up on on a lamppost so that a journalist would then cover that, so then it would get more air. So, and the students get really creative. And by doing that, it means that then they are putting themselves in the shoes of a disinformation agent, and then research shows they're better at spotting it in the wild. So that's my number one trick, is this idea of inoculation. So don't focus on the content, focus on the tactics and techniques. And on that too, there's a framework called the ABCs of disinformation: actors, behaviors, content. And when we focus on saying that content is false, it's not very successful, because as humans we're like, well, I think it might be true. Who are you to tell me? Blah, blah, blah. But if you actually say, well, can I tell you who shared that? The actor. Can I just tell you, this is actually somebody who, they have a whole host of like natural health sites, but look, they're selling supplement. Like, I'm just a bit worried that this person isn't trustworthy. And like, look at their behaviors. Like, they post 100 times a day. Like, I don't think that that's a person that we should be trusting. So if you teach about the ABCs and you get people to think much more about the A and the B, actors and behaviors, that's also a very successful way of getting people to understand this landscape, rather than, here's a piece of content, let me tell you why it's false. Because that's, as humans, we're really bad at accepting that.
Yeah, I like the point you made earlier too about we hate to admit that we're wrong.
Mhm.
Okay, so someone wants to know if the mainstream media can be trusted to vet stories to be misinformation, or are we best off trying to do so on our own and doing our own research?
Yeah, so it's a great question too. And I think one thing I'd say is, when we talk about the mainstream media, I mean, one of the great things about this country is how many news outlets there are. I mean, there are amazing local journalist outlets. Unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of them dying, but there's really thriving local journalism. There's community journalism. Then you've got the big mainstream players. And I think sometimes people, like, oh, can we trust the mainstream media? I think you can trust journalists that you can trust. That's why I say there are really excellent reporters out there. There's really excellent news outlets. Does it mean they never make mistakes? No. I do a lot of training of news outlets, and I go in to these big newsrooms and I'm like, I know that you're busy. I know that you've got fewer resources than ever, but you can't not check this stuff that you just found on Twitter. And they're like, we know, Claire, it's just like, we're, on deadline. So unfortunately, even the best journalists sometimes make mistakes. And we have to understand that when a newsroom does make a mistake, the reason that a professional outlet is a professional outlet is because it has a corrections policy. And a reputable outlet will the next day publish, we made a mistake yesterday. And so rather than like, oh, we can't trust the mainstream media, they made a mistake. Sometimes we have to recognize that mistakes happen. But there are a number of sites out there that look like the mainstream media, and they are not reputable. They do not have a corrections policy, and they're trying to peddle falsehoods and rumors. So there's actually something called pink slime websites that are all over the country. They look like local news websites, but they're actually run by political operatives designed to undermine the other candidate. But it looks like a local newspaper. So it might be like the Ohio Tribune. And you're like, oh, that sounds like a local news site. But it's not. It's what's known as a pink slime website. So when it comes to who can you trust, again, I wish I could say, if you go to these 5 websites, everything's going to be perfect. It's not, unfortunately. We need to be looking at different news outlets, but you also having, you just have to recognize that there's no one easy path, but reading around, listening to experts, being on top of what the latest scientists are saying. And it's hard. I spend all day on this stuff, and sometimes I'm still left not really knowing. And I wish that wasn't the case. But unfortunately, the flip side of all of this amazing information on the internet is sometimes hard. And so we do have to take on more ourselves to try and navigate all of this. But in the end, I think we're more informed now than we ever were. And that's a good thing, but it's not simple.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much information out there, and it's sometimes hard knowing. And so a couple of attendees were curious about consequences. What kinds of consequences do you believe there should be for those who spread misinformation, or, public agencies, and what kind of consequences do you think there should be?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one. I mean, there are countries like Brazil and South Africa where you get fined. In some countries, you can be put in prison if you share false information. I do not think that that is a good thing for all the reasons I just explained. Me, my mum, other people, often we're doing it because of the right reasons. I mean, I do think if you are a politician, I do think if you're a news outlet, I do think if you're a brand and you're advertising, then I do think there should be consequences for false claims. And we have that in advertising. You can't make a false claim. And I would say, unfortunately, now we're seeing more and more political leaders pushing false information. It then gets amplified by the news media because the news media has to cover what the politicians say. And that's not a good situation. And so I do worry that there are no consequences right now. I mean, anybody can go onto Twitter and say anything. You could go onto Twitter now and saying, oh, I hated Claire's pink blouse. It's not, I mean, that's a silly example, but what I'm saying is the great bit about the First Amendment is you can say anything, but that also means there's no consequences if people want to make up lies about you. But I think that's something that we're going to evolve as a society, where I would like it to be kind of socially unacceptable to, you know, if you push misinformation, it shouldn't be like, oh, whatever, it doesn't matter. It should be like, no, like, you don't do that. Like, you know, if the New York Times publishes something false, like, you don't do that. If the New York Times, they have to issue a correction. I worry that as people, the minute that Facebook came along, we became publishers. The fact that I can now type something and anybody around the world could see it, I'm a publisher, but there's no consequences for me if I publish something that's false. And so, but I don't have an easy answer to this, because I don't want people going to prison. I don't want people being fined as people. I do think institutions, politicians, I do think there need to be some consequences, but I don't think there's an easy answer to what those consequences would be and who would make those decisions. So I know that's not a very helpful answer, but this is really messy. I think about it all the time, and I wish there were easier answers. But like I said, this is legal speech. You know, if I said over there, that politician, they're lying, somebody else on this call would be like, no, they're not, Claire. No, they're not. And we'd get into a back and forth. And who's to say what the truth is? You know, I always think about this, maybe I'm a certain age, but when people get divorced, there's almost always two sides of the story. And actually what happened is right in the middle. And it's not that either of the two parties are lying. It's just that's the way they remember events. And I think when we talk about truth and facts, like, you know, the sun comes up, you know, there are stars in the sky, there are facts, but a lot of what we're dealing with here is the messy middle. It's the grayness of life. And that makes it much harder to think about policies, consequences, penalties. So yeah, that's what makes it so messy.
It's definitely messy. So this is an interesting one. Someone attending wanted to know if it would be possible for you to name some of the journalists that you personally trust as good reporters. But I'm gonna generalize that a little bit. Are there particular news agencies or websites or social media sources, or who do you personally trust?
Yeah, so it is a great question. I use actually Twitter a lot. So I follow a lot of journalists on Twitter. And partly I do that because if somebody posts something or says something that other people don't agree with, then they will reply and say, I don't agree with that. I mean, I read every day the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. I don't tend to watch as much television news. I listen to NPR. The Associated Press, I think, is very good for breaking news. So yeah, I think I don't even have certain, it depends on the story. You know, sometimes if I'm looking for really good reporting on platform changes or misinformation, you know, I've got 5 or 6 really excellent journalists who are on the disinformation beat, because I know that they know this world really, really deeply and they think about it all the time. But, you know, there's a great climate journalist from CNN. I don't really watch CNN very much, but the things he writes about climate, I think are excellent. So sometimes it's the news outlet, sometimes it's the topic and the beat, the person who specializes in something. But yeah, I read widely. There isn't one news source that I would say ever has any of the answers. No, there's never one news source that has all of the answers. That's what I'm trying to say.
They all have some answers.
Yeah, exactly.
So kind of building on that, someone was asking about the fact that some sources are kind of more one-sided in the press, and that may be a reason not to believe them or maybe anyone. So what steps do you think the press can take to become a more reliable source?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it's hard, I think, in this country, because I see people who are completely obsessed with one news source. So, for example, I know people who watch Fox News all day long, and I have other friends who watch MSNBC all day long, and they get a very different diet of information. And if I tried to say to somebody who watches MSNBC, hey, you should watch Fox, they were like, no, over my dead body. And the same would be the other way around. Now, that is not a good situation for democracy. And in the country I come from, the UK, we have the BBC, and it's not perfect by any stretch, but every day, something like 87% of the British public bangs into BBC News at some point. So that means that, a large proportion of the population are consuming kind of at least one source that's similar. And so when it's about reliability, I do worry that kind of the divisions around Fox and MSNBC, CNN have got so great. I don't know how you could get those audiences to consume content from the other side. But that is because I would argue both of those kind of MSNBC and Fox know what their audience is like, and they give them more of what they like. It's like the platforms. They need you to keep watching, to watch the advertisements, and they figured out what makes Fox News viewers angry, and they figured out what makes MSNBC News consumers angry, and keeps people watching in this kind of like spiral of anger. And it's really, really problematic. So I wish I had very deep pockets. You know what? I wish I was one of these tech boys that keeps putting space rockets in space. And I wish I would stop putting space rockets in space, and I would invest in journalism. And I would invest in really strong public media. I would invest in local journalism, and I would find a way to rebuild credibility in journalism. Because the problem with misinformation has also happened at the point where local news has been decimated. Local news deserts are a huge problem in America. There are many counties, even states, where there is no local news source to cover a congressperson. Like, that is insane. So there has to be a fabric of local journalists that people can trust. Another reason that trust in journalism has gone down, when people know a journalist, they are much more likely to trust journalism. If you've never met a journalist, you are much more likely in surveys to say you don't trust journalism. So we need a much stronger fabric in this country around journalism, and that is not cheap. But the fact that we have people consuming completely different news diets is a deep, deep problem, and is, I would argue, part of the misinformation problem.
And I know we're getting closer to the end of time here, but let me ask you a follow-up on that. You were talking about the situation in England, where you have so many people just consuming one source, the BBC. Do you see a danger in that?
So my own country is really divided. So we haven't talked about this, but the Brexit vote in 2016, my country has become very, very divided about that decision to leave the European Union. And I would argue that we have kind of the BBC as our television news. And ironically, television news in the UK has to be impartial. So it's the flip of the US. In the US, newspaper outlets are seen to be more impartial. But for example, Fox and MSNBC are seen to be more kind of opinion-based journalism. In the UK, we have impartial TV news, and we have very opinionated tabloid newspapers. So it's not that we don't have any kind of breadth in information, but I would just say that even with the BBC, my country is, there are real divisions around COVID and the vaccines, around Brexit. It's a very divided country as well. So, the things that we're seeing in America are happening in a number of other countries around the world. Australia just had big protests in Melbourne around the vaccine. Brazil is in a terrible situation. I mean, many, many, many democracies now are in a situation I don't think we thought they were going to be in about 30 years ago. And I do think we have to say lots of things are happening in the world that are difficult. Like I went through some of them, like economic changes, climate crisis, immigration changes. But on the other hand, we now have a lot more information than ever before. And I do think that there is a connection between the rise of technology and platforms and divisions in countries that we have to take seriously. And I do wonder what historians will say about this period in history, because there's something going on. There's something going on.
Definitely. And Kim, do we have time for one more question? Or are we about out of time here?
Can we do one more? I hate, this has been just an awesome conversation. I think we can squeeze one more in.
Sure. Okay, so someone wanted to know, And as our final question for the evening, how do you encourage critical thinking with people who simply want to believe in something that is clearly false? It's a tough one.
It is a tough one, but it goes back to some of the things I was saying, is that I'll sit with somebody and they'll be absolutely convinced. And I'll talk about some of those kind of the motivations piece. They're like, well, where did you find that? And where's that come from? And who funds that source? And, you know, maybe you're right. I'm not saying that you're wrong, but let's just interrogate this a little bit, because I would hate you to be in a situation where you're being manipulated by somebody. That is the key, like manipulation, being fooled, being hoaxed. Nobody wants to believe that they've been fooled. So if somebody really, really believes something, I mean, even if it's somebody that's watching Rachel Maddow every night or watching Tucker Carlson, like getting them to understand the news environment and the money that's involved in this and the advertising, and that these kind of positions are being shared in order to make people believe things, to what, you know, the broader you can zoom out and you can give people the context, then actually the less likely they are to hang on to those beliefs. So it's about stepping back and not focusing on the content, because as I said, nobody wants to be wrong. And you don't even want to say, oh, don't you think you should be thinking more critically? It's like, the world is complex and confusing, and there's a lot of information out there, and I don't know what I'm doing half the time, but let's figure this out together. That's a way to go, which is to make people feel that you're with them on a journey, as opposed to, oh, good job I'm here, Uncle Bob, because you're being an idiot. Like, that is the worst thing that you can do.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is going to conclude our event, and what an evening this has been. We sure covered a lot of ground. I would like to extend a big thank you to Dr. Wardle. And honestly, if you were in person, you would be getting a big round of applause. So I hope you can hear it coming your way. You've certainly given us a better understanding of what is coming at us. And along the way, you've empowered us, because you've given us information that we can fight back against these tactics. So thank you for that as well. I want to give a big, I should say it this way, we want to give a big shout out to the wonderful students and community members who chose to participate in tonight's event. And I know in this setting, we can't kind of give you all a big round of applause, but we would be doing that as well. So I hope you can also hear it. And I hope to see all of you for our upcoming winter event. So stay tuned, but thank you very much.